Devising Architecture, Amidst, Entanglements and Exigencies. I'm Rohit Mazumdar. I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture. To begin with, post-lunch sessions are usually times to snooze off, but I'm kind of guaranteeing that the work that we are about to see in both the sessions now will be building strands of thought which connect to the morning sessions, and we'll have a very robust session, not only this one but the one that follows. So the two things that I take as take-home points from the morning two sessions for myself in order to build a link with this particular session that I'm about to introduce is one, Sandeep Firmani's provocation on ecology as a cultural practice and as a lived form of practice, and Eunice's work, which opened out Hong Kong and Singapore, and I've really kind of been drawn to Hong Kong through her work, which builds a conversation actually with an anthropological work on design for the universe in a very powerful way. And in this session, you might find some of these themes continuing in the conversation. So let me invite Gauri Bharat, who is going to be who's going to be talking to us in this session. Gauri is an associate professor and program chair in architectural history and theory at CEPT University. Her work inquires into indigenous built environments and material histories, particularly of reinforced cement concrete in India. I kind of landed onto Gauri's work, and I was kind of discussing with a colleague of mine about some of the questions that were emerging in my work, and I asked her, whose work should I read? I don't find somebody writing about indigenous practices beyond the documentation of buildings from the discipline of architecture, a more kind of a social history that emerges from architecture, and Gauri's work was suggested to me. And her book, In Forest, Field and Factory, Adivasi Inhabitations in India, published in 2019, seems to be a very powerful new work that has emerged from the field of architecture. And one needs to take forest, field and factory not as physical sites, but also as conceptual provocations to think about habitation. Her other work researches on practices of making buildings in urban India, cities like Bombay, Ahmedabad, Chennai, and practices of how material becomes a mode of exploration in buildings that are otherwise not talked about, that are not the canon within architecture. So these works, along with her practice as an academic at the program of architectural history and theory, become the entry points into this conversation, which she's titled as Research as Curiosity and Care, Learning from Architecture and its Others. Welcome, Gauri. We are happy to have you in conversation. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Rohit. Thank you very much for this invitation and for staying here after lunch. As Rohit mentioned, this is a time for a snooze. Hopefully I will not make you fall asleep. I'm going to be sharing my work as a researcher, primarily. That's what I professionally do. And no, It's a particular delight to be able to share my work as a practitioner, because, like I said, I'm basically a researcher. I've been professionally researching for about 15 years now, and I teach research. That's what I primarily do. And for the most part, that automatically puts me outside of what we recognize as, or what most people think of it as. In fact, the most common complaint I get from people who've known me for a very long time is, तुम architecture क्यों नहीं करती? Why don't you do any architecture? I'm like, I am doing architectural work. I just come at this from the point of view of, from the vantage point of inquiry. So what I'll be sharing today, like Rohit mentioned, builds on some of the themes that Sandeep Bhai and Eunice very beautifully laid out in the morning. The vantage point from which I'm presenting some stories today is very, very intimate biographical. It is of the process of making sense of built environments that I have done. So I'm really coming at this from what was the nature of my training, in what ways did it allow me to make sense or not of the kinds of sites that I was studying. But before that, I'll just briefly preface it with this question of research itself. For the most part, like I said, research for the most part is seen, especially academic research, it is seen as an irrelevant kind of activity. And I'm not saying that because the program that I head, it's the tiniest program at CEP. The people, those of us who are involved, obviously it's the world to us. But nearly every year at admissions time, I will get more than one question saying, Gauri, if we get a degree in research, does that mean we will forget how to design? And that has to do with the perception of research, not just for the applicants, but their families. They have had, their advisors and mentors from university, from their undergraduate program saying, research mat karna, you'll forget how to design, you'll forget how to do anything practical. And so the perception of research is, at least in India, is of this very self-indulgent kind of activity where people think, they write using big words in jargon, and they write about things that have very little to do with anything real, be it practice, be it buildings. To a large extent, this it's not unfounded. If you read a lot of writing, well, a lot of architects don't read as well, but those who do read, you will find that a lot of writing is it's incredibly opaque, it's dense, and it pretty much doesn't make any sense. So the allegation is not entirely unfounded, but that is not what research is. That is research done badly. Research at its fundamentals, it is knowledge production. And it is unfortunate because the perception of research as being irrelevant is unfortunate because we need a systematic culture of inquiry. We need an education system that encourages students to follow their curiosity. A large part of our education system, whether it's in high school, whether it's in architecture school, is extremely conformist. You are expected to know answers to questions, which means you're supposed to be sure about things. So a lot of the students that I teach and I have encountered elsewhere are very afraid to admit things that they don't know. And because of that, it becomes a habit, and it also kind of subdues their curiosity. If we constantly play within the domains of what we know, we are never really pushing the limits of our knowledge, right? So my basic point when I work with younger students, and by younger students, I mean people who are starting off, is to say that, you need to bring back your curiosity, pay attention to the things you don't know, because that is where you're going to learn. If we constantly focus on things that we know, that others know, we are not expanding our knowledge, we are not expanding disciplinary knowledge either. The second thing is to pay attention. To pay attention to what it is, whatever it is, and not to what we think it is. And that act of paying attention, that act of being careful about what it is that we are seeing, how we are seeing, why we are seeing, makes us attentive to details, to differences, to other people and other points of view. I'll build a little more on this, but I'll start now with a few snippets from my research journey. My initial foray as a researcher, I was interested in research. We have an undergraduate research degree we had to do. I studied at SEPT. I was always interested in indigenous architecture. I was very interested in sort of ordinary environments. I come from a small town myself. I was very interested in kind of, people, what people are doing, especially odd things. By the time I graduated, and as with many young graduates, there was a considerable degree of anxiety and disillusionment. The world of practice, as I had dipped into during my internship and the couple of early employment opportunities, the world of practice was a very messy place. It had none of the sort of ideological purity of the classroom. There were no wonderful discussions about what places meant and what people wanted and the higher purpose of architecture. The practice was all about negotiating with contractors, making sure that the material supplier is sending the proper kind of wood, making sure that the laborers are doing their work, dealing with clients who were throwing their weight around. The space of practice was obviously very messy, and it was very disillusioning. This experience is not unique to me. It continues to happen. So many young graduates, especially those who came into architectural studies, who are graduating with the hope of doing something meaningful, are in for a rude shock when they graduate. So that is around the time when I decided to do a postgraduate degree. And I was, like I said, I was very interested in people. I was interested in what is their relationship with their environment. So for my So around that time was my first introduction. I'm also from Eastern India. So my first introduction to Adivasi villages. These are villages of a community. They are known as Santals. Extremely numerous. So like Bhils, Gonds, Santals. I mean, there are more than 15-20 million Santals all over India. So these are villages in South Jharkhand. And so I went on my first visit. I knew I wanted to see tribal villages, so I went. And I saw stuff like this, and I fell in love. I'm still in love, but as you can imagine, as an architect, it ticked every box. Really beautifully made houses, made out of mud. In fact, this particular photograph is a particular favorite. Those men are repairing a ceremonial drum. So, you can see sort of a cultural practice at play. You can see a set of buildings that are really quite painstakingly and very beautifully put together. There's traditional material. These are built out of, these are done in, it's a cob wall construction. All the colors are natural. So all around it was just, it was complete, it sucked me in. Sorry, I'm just trying to, yeah. The interiors of the houses were equally kind of beautiful. These Santals, this group of Santals, they are agriculturists, they are paddy cultivators. So they had their cattle. The image that you're seeing on the right, that's the wall of a cattle. So some family that pays so much attention to making a wall for a cattle shed was clearly sort of working on tradition as we knew it. So here was this lovely kind of synthesis of culture and architecture as, as the ideological young graduate in me had imagined. Just right there. Oops. And then there were the murals. Santals are renowned. There are more, in Jharkhand itself, there are more than 40 different Adivasi communities, and amongst those 40 communities, the Santals are renowned for the quality of their domestic murals. Nobody paints their houses as exquisitely as Santals do. This particular wall, it almost looks like a, Marks and Spencer fancy wrapping paper. It has that kind, and this is done by, usually the wall murals are always painted by women. So exquisite works of art. So all in all, it was just, it was completely very attractive. So what I started doing, so I did my undergraduate dissertation on this, and I was very fascinated at that point in time to find out that Santals believe that they cohabit the world with spirits. And so there is also this idea of sacred landscape. There are certain parts of the built environment which are believed to be abodes of spirits. So this is a sacred grove of one of the communities. So then in 2011, I started my PhD. And during my PhD, I was very interested in understanding the sort of cultural underpinnings. So here was this architectural entity, this village, and not just one village, it's all of South Jharkhand is dotted with such villages. And clearly there was some similarity. So I was very interested in decoding what exactly is that cultural schema that underpins this kind of, what gives the village its form, what gives the houses their form. So I started measure drawing and, sorry, stay here. So I measured through a large number of houses spread out across some 11 villages. And that is when the first kind of hitch occurred. So from these houses, I knew they're all Santhal houses. They're all of the same community. There is a shared history. There is a shared belief system. The houses don't look the same. And as architects, we largely believe, we worship the type. We believe in type. If there is no type, it's a moment of sort of our universe falls apart because the coherence just isn't there. So here I was, measure drawing house after house and finding a whole range of layouts. Some houses were small, some were large, some had courtyards, some had multiple rooms, some had, and all sorts of configurations. In earlier scholars' work, I had read that Santhal houses are oriented in the cardinal directions. That was about the only logic. All of these houses are oriented north up. That was about the only logic. But for the rest of it, there was a set of functions that was similar. But looking at the houses, it was very difficult to extract any kind of cultural notion of what the house was. I eventually got my head around that, but so one clue, that moment of, okay, how on earth am I going to kind of resolve, how do I make sense of this? Over extended period of fieldwork, so I was making these houses for 2 years, speaking to people. One of the questions I'd ask most people was, how did you make houses earlier? Purane zamane mein ghar kaise banate the? Finally, and most people would say, like this only. As anyone who's done worked with communities, you get the most vague answers. It was like, we build like this only. So there was one person who said, after many conversations, she said, come, I'll show you an old house. And she took me here. So I said, but all the houses look like this. She said, no, this is an old house. It took me a while to figure out that the older houses were larger. The walls are much higher. The wooden members are much thicker because it comes from a time when forests were more plentiful, and they had a concentric layout. Then when I went back to the plans, the 50 plans that I had my chart of, I started marking off wherever I could see the concentric layouts. And that is when it struck me that what I had actually mapped out was houses that had grown over a period of time. I knew that in my head, but I was drawing a plan, and as Eunice mentioned, plans are static things. So the moment you put things on a plan, as an architect, again, we are trained to assume that everything that we've drawn on the plan is related to each other. It probably comes from the same kind of origin moment and is coherent. So the difficulty was in the way in which I was drawing it. My training had trained me to draw a plan or a section, not to draw things that are changing over a period of time. Even now, once we understand transformation of a time, we can represent it. But to draw something as if it has transformed over a period of time requires us to constantly critique the very tool that we are fundamentally using. So the difficulty really was, with the tools that I was trained to think. So the idea of plans, so if I just take a moment here to digress, that The idea of drawing plans as a way of conceptualizing any architectural work is of recent vintage. Most traditional craftspeople, as Sandeep Bhai mentioned, artisans, they don't draw plans. What they have is actually a series of micro relationships, structural systems, and sequences of processes. Those result in a building. The form of the building is not a priori. When we draw plans, we are privileging the form of the building. So effectively, when we draw plans of pre-industrial structures, we are using a very different logic of representation onto a set of buildings that don't share that logic. I don't have an answer on how we draw pre-industrial buildings. What I do know that plans do limit our understanding. And that's not just true of buildings, anything that is in movement. It's incredibly difficult to make sense of something that is constantly shifting. If you look at projects that work with ephemeral structures, for instance, the plan, the section, even the 3-dimension. The 3rd dimension allows you to appreciate form. It very rarely does it allow you to appreciate structure, the logic of construction, the sequence of construction. So clearly, what I was struggling with was I was trying to imagine buildings that were not built with the logic of an architectural whole, but I was using the representational tools of an architectural whole to represent these. So anyways, I worked through that and eventually I got my head around. Now I look at any building and the first thing I'm looking at is what would have come earlier and what would have come later. So I've trained my mind to think that way. I still don't have the tools to work with. The next the more interesting glitch, so to say, in my work, next slide please. So like I said, I was very interested in the cultural schemes, so how do Santals, how do the villagers think about their built environment? I knew how I was thinking about it. I was, like I said, I was absolutely fascinated by the, the graphic quality of the murals, the layout of spaces, but I was interested in what did people think? Where did meaning lie for the villagers themselves? I knew what was significant as an architect, but where did meaning lie for the Adivasi villagers? So in order to try and find a common ground to have a conversation about the significance of architecture, I tried a number of things. This was one of those experiments. I got children to make drawings. I handed cameras to people and I made them walk around. Each medium came with its challenges. But I did a series of exhibitions. So every time I'd finish fieldwork, I would put up an exhibition in the village. And so I put up drawings, I put up photographs. And so I was talking to people and saying, okay, this is what I think represents the village. What do you think represents the village? Now, this question to most of us is going to sound fairly straightforward, except that I was doing this in Hindi. And I was trying to say, what will I call represent? So then I said, okay, imagine I'm putting up an exhibition about your community in the neighboring city. What should I pick? Then they are like, what should you pick? Meaning you pick anything you want. So I said, no. What is significant? So I had to break significance. So first I said mahatvapurn, sounded very much like bureaucraties. So I said, nahi, zaruri kya hai? But zaruri is utilitarian, it's usefulness. Then, so I struggled, I didn't come up, but I used a cluster of words to say, okay, if you had to tell me which of these represent your culture, I did a bad job of it, but it worked. Then what I said that by this time people were used to reality shows. So I said, imagine that, you have to vote for these images. Which ones would you vote for? And that got people, giving the kinds of answers that maybe I wanted to hear. But anyways, so that got somewhere. And it was very interesting because, like I said, I was fascinated by houses, the grazing grounds, the fields, and all sorts of things. Let me see. So these are just, photographs of, it was like a mela. It was terrific fun. I don't think I've done anything fun like this ever since. Next slide. Let me see if that changes. Yeah. So this is when I was trying to ask them that, what do you think? I asked various groups of people. So the unanimous choice in, So the unanimous choice, vote number one, without exception. So I did 5 exhibitions in 5 different villages. The first choice was always the sacred grove. Now Santals believe in spirits, they worship, and the sacred grove is their primary site of worship. There's nothing to see. It's an unbuilt site. But within the sacred geography of Santals, this is the most significant location. It is a site of, it can become a site of serious conflict, but the Santals believe that if you offend spirits, then misfortune will befall. And so they are very, very careful to make sure that the sacred grove is protected. So far, so good. A site of cultural significance, and the villagers have selected that this is important. It was the second choice, which was very, very curious. Again, without exception, all 5 villages, they chose the village school. The village school in some couple of villages was actually a functioning institution. So far, so good. They even chose the village school in places where the school did not function. The children were hanging around with me all the time. Nobody was actually going to school at any point in time. Yet the villagers insisted that it is the village school that is the most important, that is most representative of their, of them. So it was, and I asked them why, and they said that when you tell other people about us, please tell them that we are developed. Adivasis are developed. We are not jungly people. So this was a very clear framing of their identity. So for me, things like their chulha, the murals, all of which are exquisitely crafted objects, and they are clearly an index of the sort of traditional skills, knowledge systems of Adivasi communities. But in every exhibition, they completely ignored this. I would ask them, don't you think the houses are, important? Don't you think these walls? And they were like, nah, not really. So that exhibition was a major moment of realization. I had assumed as an architect that meaning, cultural meaning, lay in the buildings. But the villagers themselves had completely different frames of reference. In most cases, in many, many cases, we dismiss this as people don't know. What we are also saying assessments of what it is that we are talking about. That's the nature of our work. We make places on behalf of other people, which means we are always assuming meaning on behalf of other people. So the key question is, how do we train ourselves to be more responsive? So I'll share one more anecdote and then return to this question of, okay, how do we make ourselves more responsive? There was one more differentiation in this village exhibition. During the exhibition, most of the people who responded were men. The women would come. I'd become friends with lots of them. So they would come, we'd have a chat, I'd ask them what they're cooking. But they never really offered me an answer. They said, the sacred grove. And when they did, they also said the sacred grove was important. Which was very interesting because women are not allowed into the sacred grove. Women do not participate in the ritual and the public life of the community. So for women to select the sacred grove as being important was a very curious disconnect in my mind. But then that also made me realize that a lot of what I was doing, and this is a realization that has been emerging slowly, a lot of what I was doing, I was there as a PhD scholar. The gendered nature of my engagement with the site became apparent to me only towards the end. But the fact was, I was there as a woman, I was a married woman, and I had 2 children. My affinities were with all the other women. So very often in the afternoons, I would hang out with them, and I could hang out with them because I was a woman. Male scholars had never hung out with women. So there is a lot of scholarship on Santhal villages. As a Adivasi community, they have got the fascination of colonial ethnographers since the mid-19th century. So there are lots of monographs written about Santhal culture. It is only when I started doing my study that we think of a lot of those monographs as representative of the culture. In reality, a lot of those monographs are representative of the public domains of Santhal life, which is the male domains of Santhal life. There is actually very little that we know about the women, and what we know about the women has come from women scholars. So basically, what was very clearly at play here was a very gendered kind of axis that I had and that all of us have. When we've gone for field work, when I take a mixed group for field work, the men will talk to the boys, the women will talk to the girls. Very rarely does it happen otherwise. But whenever I've taken groups of only girls, a lot of my students are only girls, then this fieldwork dynamics is different. We rarely acknowledge the fact that when we are working as architects, as researchers, we are going there with our gendered and socialized bodies. We are not going there as this abstract architect who has some kind of universal access to the site. But this idea of subjectivity is absolute anathema in architectural discourses. Whenever I introduce this in any class, from first year to postgraduate to doctoral students, there is squirming discomfort. We are trained to believe that there has to be some universal truth, there has to be some objective truth. Whereas in reality, all access that we have to any site, to any body of information is always gendered, it is always socialized. If you dressed differently, if you were recognizably different, you would not have access to the sorts of things that you otherwise have. Unfortunately, what this idea of objectivity has done is that it has normalized a whole lot of things that we don't know about. So my own, when I was following women around, I was following, so the middle slide, she's brewing rice liquor, which only women do. So there were a whole lot, whole sets of activities that I was, privy to, simply because, all my research friends were women. There is this anxiety that if you're talking about a subjective vantage point, you're talking about something that's impartial, that's incomplete, and that is what we have to sort of recognize, that the presumed objectivity of discourses historically until this point is a myth. All narratives have come from specific vantage point. The question that each one of us has as a researcher is, what is the nature of our subjectivities? What is the position from which we enter a given field of problem? And can we acknowledge and play to the strengths that these specific points of view afford us? This has, I have since moved on to other research topics, and the key work that I'm doing on now is, as Rohit mentioned, I'm working on a history of concrete. Now it seems like a bit of a jump from studying Adivasi villages to studying concrete. Where it kind of ties up is that it started with sort of getting interested. I've been interested in history. I've been very interested in buildings also. For all my disillusionment with architecture and practice, I'm very interested in how things are made. And it started as a series of student projects in the postgraduate program, which was new at that point in time. We had started in 2014. And we were looking at the question of how are buildings made. And all the messiness that had sort of disillusioned me earlier came into full play. We were looking at buildings being made not just in the mind of the architect, but actually on a construction site. So we were looking at, as an analytical entry point, we were interested in, okay, so how are buildings made and how were buildings made? So when I started with this question of looking for the earliest concrete building, we had started looking at buildings in and around Sept, and we had found, okay, so 1954, we know that Le Corbusier is there. There is all the famous buildings, Sanskar Kendra, the Atma Milonas building, all the famous Corbusier buildings are there. Chandigarh is there. But we were looking at some buildings in the vicinity of Sept, 1940s, and we found that, oh, there's an architect who's practicing. So if you're in Ahmedabad, architecture starts at Sept. Nothing existed before. We've sort of pretty much erase that, and I'm saying that sarcastically just in case it wasn't clear. So when we started looking at the 1940s, we were like, oh, so there's a practicing architect. There is Brisolil, there is concrete work. Then we came across another building, exposed concrete building done not by Corbusier. And so basically it opened up that there is concrete construction happening before Corbusier. So then I started looking, and then I made it a personal project. So I was into, okay, so what is the oldest concrete building? And that is where, and at the same time, again, my very minute forays into practice, we were trying to get some concreting done at a very remote location, actually at my parents' place in Eastern India. And it was so difficult. We couldn't find somebody to do formwork properly. We couldn't find somebody to do bar bending properly. We couldn't find somebody to even mix the concrete accurately, and then to compact and vibrate the whole thing. So the idea of looking at a concrete building was not one building, but it was an entire ecosystem of practices. So that is where my project became about the ecosystem of concrete construction and not so much about the individual architect. So at the center of my work on historic sites right now, I'm really not looking at architects. I'm looking at building contractors, trade magazines, material suppliers, and all the different individuals and processes that are involved, which has now increasingly, I think we need to reconceive the architect, not as a remote, removed and impartial figure, but really as a situated and engaged individual. We have to turn the gaze back on what it is that people do in an architectural office and use that as a framework for rethinking architectural works. So we have to look at historic works also as being shaped by the pushes and pulls of building contractors, materials, clients, resources, money. So with this, the role of research, and I'll just wrap up here, the role of research inherently is to expand the boundaries of knowledge from a vantage point that ties into who the practitioners are. And the role of research is to make judgments, but not about the forms of building devoid of people or any affect, but about the conflicting needs, the strategies for achieving ends, the responsiveness, the complicity of clients, contractors, other agents involved in a work. So then the conceptualization of architectural knowledge needs to be sensitive to people, materials, processes, and their entanglements with rights, power, hierarchies, exploitations, privilege. Every work of architecture is extracting material. Every work of architecture is being built on land that was previously used for something else. That's the foundational truth of any building project. Research and histories need to acknowledge that so that we have a more relevant frame of discourse within which we situate our work. So it is only by being fully engaged in the sort of exigencies of a real work that research can work towards seeking truth. And that really is the very foundations of an epistemology of care. Thank you.
Can you all hear me now? Thanks, Gauri. It was really wonderful listening to you, and I like the way you started off your talk and came back a full circle to answer the question on what do we do when we do research and what does it mean to think about research as care, while you opened out with some of the problems that, some of the kind of, doubts that a lot of people have about research and some of the misgivings that exist around it. And as you were going through your work, one other thing that kind of stood out was um, the reflexivity with which you were talking about what you did actually in the field, and how did you come to interpret it later, in the sense that whether it was about the cartographic drawings, whether it was about the exhibition that you held, whether it was about questions of gender in the field, and what could you access and not access within the field, and how did the field then appear to you. And while you've not kind of talked much about the material work over here, I have read your paper that you've circulated with me, so it's far more richer than actually what you kind of presented over here. So what I'm going to do is I have kind of, three areas where I want to open up inquiry, and they connect with both your actual areas of inquiry, but also the program of architectural history and theory, as you all have framed it in kind of in sept. Let me begin with your kind of your field experience of having exhibited these photographs and plans that you took back to the Santals. And what we've seen today across both the panels, and particularly in Sandeep's work that he presented to us, uh, when you ask questions about dwelling and home amongst indigenous communities, you're getting surprising responses, in the sense that it's not the dwelling structure where one might be sleeping at night, that is what is pointed to, but many other spaces. At sea, we've been asking this question, of ontological question, about what is home. And here the home then opens out as a series of many kinds of spaces. In my own field work, as I was doing this field work in Sanjay Gandhi National Park, I had this moment. I was using the term forest repeatedly, and in spite of having read Descola's work, I was making that flagrant mistake of using that term in conversation, and particularly with elders, and I was being corrected again and again and again. What you call a forest is our garden. So Adivasis living in Sanjay Gandhi National Park don't see their space, the space that they live in, as a forest. They see it as a garden. And this garden, the idea of the bark or the garden, is very different from the idea of what a Mughal garden or a plantation would be. It does not translate into the same. So I'm at that moment, the question then that starts emerging for me is that while one recognizes that this kind of there's a different ontological frame from which the idea of space emerges, but some of the changes that you're seeing actually reference colonial epistemologies, in the sense that you build houses because of certain laws and regulations in Sanjay Gandhi National Park with asbestos sheets, with material that you would have not otherwise used. And while the ontological frame becomes important, one realizes in the politically charged environment, Adivasis move between colonial as well as indigenous epistemologies and ontologies, that it is not one frame that they kind of, hold on to. They have to continuously move between both the frames based on their situation that they are in, which is my kind of first question, to really open out the politicization of how do we think about ontology in this particular moment. And why? Because your fieldwork was done in 2011. 2011 was also the year when the census was done, and we're recognizing that more and more India, or people are coming to live India's cities. And as you kind of talk about, as your book kind of talks about, it's the conceptual analogy, forest, field, and factory are not probably three different moments in time, but are movements that may happen in the same time across different kinds of individuals. And these movements call us to think between ontologies, between indigenous ontologies and epistemologies, as well as colonial epistemologies and ontologies. And I asked this question also in connection with the first panel, where Sandeep presented his work. And one of the questions that emerged for me, and it's a work that me and my colleagues, some of my colleagues, Prasad Khanolkar, Dipti Baindarkar, and Dushyant are asking in our settlement study course, when you have to map the environment, which is dynamic, which is not static, how do you make a map of it, which is continuously moving? And that movement may not have to be only about the cycle of the weather, but having to move between different kinds of ontologies and epistemologies. So that's the first provocation for you to kind of think about. I mean,
Thank you. I'll start. So my first kind of, again, quick response is that my understanding is that for Adivasi societies, they have modernized the way in which other non-Adivasi societies have modernized. So in my experience, what I found, the use of the word forest, I think there was a definite adoption of terminologies used by the state. So a lot of people would describe themselves as ST or SC to me. So there is a very specific way in which Adivasi communities are appropriating the language of the state in order to explain how they inhabit certain places. So the language of the state is very much part of their ontology. Also, Adivasi societies are not obviously homogeneous. And for as many Adivasis who are resisting, whether it was a colonial state or the modern state, because for many Adivasi societies there is a continuity. Their exclusion has remained constant. There are just as many Adivasis who have aligned with the state. I mean, the state of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Uttarakhand was premised on Adivasi autonomy. So the reason why I'm saying all this is, it is very difficult to delineate what an Adivasi ontology is. Especially, I was very aware of the fact that I did not share that cultural space. And what does it mean? So that has been one of those, I think it's also a perpetual question that how do we fully understand what somebody else's view of the world is? My response to that has been to create moments of dialogue, to recognize the difference. That's really where it is. So I don't think we can explain, but we can create encounters. And in those encounters, there will be a productive delineation of some of these differences.
Well, yeah, I mean, that kind of came about very strongly as you presented your work. And so, I mean, I would still kind of, push and urge you a little bit, although you kind of mentioned that, I know that there exists a problem with the plan and the section, but I don't know how to kind of address that problem, which is what you kind of mentioned. I was kind of wondering, was that at that moment in time, in the field work, when this kind of recognition happens, how do we then change our modes of inquiry, both in the field, in terms of drawing in the field, but also kind of thinking about drawings that make arguments about this? And in this case, the 5 photographs that they chose, the sacred grove, the school, the cattle shed, spaces of fields and other environmental features, I'm forgetting the fifth one, but these ones. Why then go ahead to draw the house in its cartographic ways, and how can we move beyond that to talk about the home? What languages of inquiry open out to us?
Uh, Increasingly, for in my work, I'm seeing a clear separation between how I need to think about these versus in what ways is this meaningful to, and therefore how do I communicate this with the people that I'm working with. So, for as trained as an architect, being able to draw is central for us to being able to understand the logic of space. And for that reason, actually, it's slightly ironic. I prefer standard architectural drawings because there is tremendous potential and it's a shared language. So I'm very wary of very funky SketchUp models simply because there is no graphic rigor to that. You'll reproduce a sexy form, but I don't understand what the logic of it is. Give me an AutoCAD drawing, and I understand grid lines, I understand structure, I understand elevation. So for myself, I prefer to draw standard architectural drawings as a way of figuring things out for myself. Communicating with other people is a whole different ballgame. And we've done student exercises, we've done exhibitions, we've developed games out of narratives, but community events which are multimedia. So I worked, like I said, with getting children to make drawings of their environment. That was very, very instructive. So for the community to be able to, and more importantly, to be able to sit down with communities and explain to them why particular sites matter. I'm working with the Center for Heritage Conservation at the moment, so in most cases, we are working on historic sites which are threatened. So there we are working with communities to try and explain to them why a site may matter in the first instance, or to try and elicit from them why they think some of this matters. So that currently is very exploratory, but I've been working a lot with children because that's where there is sort of really a lot of open-endedness. So games, drawings, storytelling, doing walks, maps. So now there is a separation between how I draw for myself and how I engage with communities.
Okay. I mean, then I was kind of, just to build on that, I was wondering, why would you then frame, if this is if there is a particular way, there's a particular epistemology in which knowledge is constructed amongst different kinds of communities, and as Prasad, when he opened up in the morning, the provocation for this conference, 95% of the people in this country do not, think with or kind of get architectural services, or do not follow the kind of architectural drawings that one kind of is trained to kind of produce. And what does it mean to kind of term this whole group, and in this particular case as architecture's other? And is there, does it kind of then continue the colonial impositions of knowledge and expertise that we've kind of been trained with? And given also the Supreme Court judgment at the present moment that beyond architects, many professionals can build buildings, they may not use the term architect. What might it mean to open out the idea of expertise amongst a whole polyphony of voices that kind of exist in the making of buildings themselves? And does your work on material explorations, particularly older historical work in the early 20th century, also talk to us about this in any kind of way, including the work on indigenous environments?
I'm trying to think where to start.
In the
There's
sense
so
that,
many ideas. Sorry.
No, sorry, just how do we open out or expand the idea of expertise in this case?
So the first acknowledgement, in a sense, is that architectural works are always already produced by groups of people. As either Prasad or Sandeep or someone mentioned in the morning, that actually the average architecture student is not, or the average architect is not going to be able to build a brick wall or prepare a reasonable concrete mix. They're not even going to be able to touch cement. By default, we are already dependent on the knowledge and the skill of very large numbers of people. Our biggest shortfall is that neither have educational spaces acknowledged that, neither has discourse. The architect stands alone. Even now, if you look at any popular website, they'll mention the name of the architect. There's nobody else mentioned. So I think in the first instance, just recognizing that the architect works with so many other people, and then paying attention to the kinds of knowledge networks that are instrumental in producing a work of architecture. That has certainly shown up in the, so my work on concrete, I'm starting in the 1860s, and I think the first architect appears in 1920. So there's about 80 years where there's a whole bunch of buildings, some pretty remarkable things that are getting built all over the country. They're being done by military engineers, by building contractors. In fact, I think there's an exhibition on right now in Mumbai on Mumbai's first engineer. I'm forgetting the Parsi gentleman's name. Mirzaban. Yeah, there's an exhibition on right now. Sorry? Yeah, yeah. So it's ironic that we are, and all institutions have had this terrifically protectionist tendency around only architects do this, but everybody does that. Every client who has seen Pinterest thinks they know how to design. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I think it's unproductive to be in denial of the fact that building knowledge is not as specialized as we would like it to be. That's certainly true historically, and I'll just share this quick anecdote. The same protectionist tendencies that we're talking about now, Claude Batley has done a lecture when he took over as president of the Institute of Architects, bemoaning the fact that people don't respect the expertise of architects, architects are not getting the fees that they're supposed to be getting, laborers are not listening to them, and that is, I think, in the 1930s. Cut back 50 years earlier, 1880s, PWD engineers are bemoaning the fact that the military engineers don't take them seriously, laborers are not working properly. So it's really just another history that's waiting to be written, but the fact that building knowledge is incredibly diffused is the norm, it's not the exception.
Absolutely. Nice. I'll kind of finish off with one last point, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments from the audience. And you started off with making a point about the architectural history theory program at SET. And you kind of argued in your work that a studio-based design practice is one of the many kinds of practices that could be opened up. And in fact, at this moment, we need to think with a diversity of practices that architects could engage with. It was one of the points that was kind of made yesterday in our graduates in our graduation ceremony, as we all had a conversation, that we need to think about diversity of practices. So could you talk a little bit or kind of open that idea out, in the sense that you could probably do it through what is it that the history theory program may open out in terms of an idea of practice amongst architects. The obviously known things are that they could be architectural historians or theorists, they could curate exhibitions, but does it extend beyond that, and how does it open up the world of practice for them?
In the PG program, we've been using studio-based pedagogy to offer research training. And so the key difference is that obviously instead of a building, the students are working towards exhibitions and papers. The potential of studio-based learning is obviously that it lends itself to a closely mentored but open-ended exploration of a given site. Architects as such do a whole range of things. We know architects who become film directors, they become exhibition specialists, interior designers. What we are trying to do is to train them in critical thinking. As I was mentioning earlier, the average undergraduate education in India today, students literally have not read 5 books. There aren't any libraries. So when I interview people, there are people who say, I'm really interested in history. I have only read Kevin Lynch, or a few pages online. Or if we are lucky, somebody has read, I can't even remember, but it's literally, and I'm not even exaggerating here. So the fact that we need an educated professional body to be able to recognize a range of things that people can do. All architectural projects now, especially if people are doing large projects, they are as much image building projects, they are as much social engineering projects, as they are just design projects. All architects are working with, especially architects who are working in historic sites, are by default dealing with a whole range of questions, from the chemical composition of lime to what is the relationship of a community. So we are talking, architectural professionals have always historically been, they've always multitasked. But now the challenges are becoming more complex, and better preparedness is crucial. What a critical education does is it allows you to become a better learner. So we are now experimenting with regenerating historical, like how do you reimagine something in the 1950s using AI? Now, in order to be able to do that productively, you have to be able to critique the biases that the system comes with. So in future, hopefully we will have researchers who have learned coding or who specialize in, it would be terrific to have like a historian of building bylaws. There are so many things that we need people to have a rigorous understanding of, so that we are simply better prepared to deal with the overwhelming kind of context we are in. So we are working on a few things. Like I said, we are a really tiny program. And we've got a bunch of people who are really interested in the 19th century now, people who are getting interested in writing better for public audiences, because public discourse needs to be better. You need an educated client in order to build a good project. So overall, just, hopefully in the future we will have more people who are researching simply to uplift the level of both academic and public discourse.
Thanks, Gauri. I'll just open up this conversation to the audience to take questions, comments. So there is Vikram, and then Ravi, Krisha, then Prasad. I think we'll take these four comments, and then we'll get you to respond. Yeah. So Vikram, yeah. Ravi, then you kind of get it here.
Hi Gauri, I have a train of thought and also a hypothetical question that comes from it. So if there's no answer, it's okay. I picked on a thread that you mentioned while you were presenting the ideas that the indigenous community had of their buildings and spaces of significance for them. There is no correlation, or there is very little correlation to the spaces that they find significant, or the objects, culturally that they find significant, that may or may not have anything to do with the building, but more their lifestyle. And I'm expanding the scale a little bit to go into the city, the metropolis, and even the globe. I feel, it's a personal opinion, that today the research that's conducted before, let's say, building a city or building parts of a city is always more empirical, and like the forms or things that emerge out of it are given a false sense of significance that, based off, romanticizing, in a very fake manner with some global ideas that somebody else has thought, for us. in a city. Now, my question to you is, have you imagined or have you ever thought of what would happen if, the trains of thoughts or the ideas that these indigenous communities have, if that kind of a significant idea comes from the lifestyle of an individual and not from like a global romantic poetic idea, what kind of cities we would make or what kind of buildings within cities we would make?
Can we take another question? We'll take 3 more questions and then.
It's not a question actually, but a thought crossed my mind while you were presenting your exhibition to that community. I was just wondering if it would have been really interesting to ask the women to draw, because they were the ones who were drawing on the walls all the time, to draw what was their understanding of their world. Because it would have brought to surface something completely different. Just a thought that crossed my mind.
Can I just quickly respond to that? I asked them. They repeatedly told me they don't know how to draw because they've not been to school. The children knew how to draw because they had been to school. Absolute deadlock. They just wouldn't draw.
I just want to, first of all, thank you. I mean, so many things you said resonated with the kind of questions and discussions that we are having at sea itself. So thanks so much for that solidarity of thought. I was just trying to push you to ask, open up a little bit on the gendering of knowledge, that part that you brought out, no? that whole, like, the women researchers see things differently, women get access to knowledge differently, men get access to knowledge differently. Then what happens to concepts, and then what happens to knowledge, what happens to space, spatiality, the question of gender itself. So just open up that part for us a little bit if you've thought.
Hi, it was an intriguing research, thank you. I have a very direct question actually. So after you presented, what actually crossed my mind is that the first research, the research that you presented had a very clear-cut methodology that you were following. But then later, when you said that you are interested in researching about the history of concrete, which is a very different kind of research. So can you open up the idea of methodology? Because what kind of methodology you laid out when you are getting into the research of history of concrete?
So I'll combine the individual and the gendered question. There is a lot of writing, so I'll first start with that because there's a lot of scholarship, there's a lot of writing on feminist scholarship and the difference that it makes to research. The simple, and I'm going to say this a little simplistically, so it might just sound a little odd. If we don't acknowledge the gender question or the fact that our access to any site is partial, our general assumption is that whatever we have seen and we know, that is the whole. The fact that I was repeatedly not getting access to the sacred grove, again, theoretically I know, I'm a woman, that's why I'm not getting it. But what does that mean? So I'll give you a very specific, again, anecdote. So there's one scholar who's written a famous book, it's a groundbreaking book, and it's considered like a tome in Santal cultural studies. He was French. So the thing with most male anthropologists is when they would come to study a village, now in order to participate in the ritual life of a village, Santals are divided into clans. So without exception, all the male scholars, including some of my contemporaries from other places, they would come to a village and they would get adopted by one of the families. So once you get adopted by the family, you belong to the clan. So if you were a married person, your wife would then do all the rituals like any bahu would do. So the men would participate in the sacrificing of the cock, whatever, according to the rules of the clan. By the time I went to do fieldwork, I was married. there was no way that my husband was going to come to the site to get adopted into one of the families. But as a married woman, I was a complete outsider at multiple levels. My father doesn't belong there, my husband doesn't belong there. So the fact that I could not access any of the ritual practices pretty much meant that being able to reflect on what is it that people are doing, because a lot of being on site is to develop a sense for what are people doing, how are they feeling, and that's the reason why we go on site. Now that entire thing was not accessible. So there was that anxiety about, does that mean that my research won't be complete? So that is when I started reading a lot of feminist ethnography, which was really that, no, there is a universe of women which male ethnographers don't have access to, which I had access to. So really the inner private lives of women. So for instance, women, Santals believe that somebody can cast an evil eye on your food. It is possible that if somebody, and so you will eat something and you will fall ill. So people always cook and eat behind doors. Now I was able to sit with some of the women when they were cooking, which somebody else can't do. What does interiority mean? What are the thresholds of interiority? Those were all things that were accessible to me. But more generally, I am an upper caste straight woman. If I was a lower caste person, if I was a LGBTQ person, it would be incredibly difficult to navigate a lot of the questions. Fieldwork is incredibly difficult if you don't conform to whatever heteronormative. I mean, already I look like a boy, and that was already a matter of discomfort very often. But it is, so that's what I know from mentoring younger students who one of my students was actually undergoing sex transformation, and it was very difficult to do fieldwork. So that is at the level of just personal access, but even the nature of what is it that you access and how you make sense. If you are aware of the fact that when we do fieldwork, we hear the dominant voices. When you are aware that there is more, you actively seek out the non-dominant voices. So now every time we do community exhibitions for any project, we make sure that we find where do the Dalits live, where do the Harijans live. We make sure that we try and speak to them. We try and make sure that we try and speak to the women. So you just seek out those who don't fall within the norm. And just to connect that to your question, you do find a difference. I do find a difference in, the kinds of things that people choose. But if I had to imagine something that is not mediated by kind of global pushes and pulls, I think all of us are now. Thanks to smartphones, everyone wants, I don't know, a dress like Alia Bhatt or to look like Ranveer Singh. No matter where you go, I don't think there's any escaping. And it's not that what we know is not outside. Everything we know is constantly shaped by all of these ideas. It doesn't, it messes up things, but that's only because we have a purist notion of cultures. If you leave the purist notion out, and I mean, all of us are sitting here and speaking in English. So that's a major colonial hangover, but then I don't know Marathi, I don't know any other language. So the fact that we are all a mess of kind of complexities, it's a nice thing. Oh, yeah, sorry, method. Oh, I'm so sorry. I will be very quick because otherwise I'll be here for the next 2 hours. The second project, my concrete project, is dealing mostly with archival material. So I'm working with reports written by engineers, building contractors, and things like that. What I'm working with is really to try and map out. So when I look at a building now, what I'm effectively asking is, where would the cement have come from? Where would the steel have come from? Who would have done the formwork? And where would the labor for all this come from? And whether it required precision, in which case, where would the supervisor have come from? And in most engineering reports, these kinds of things are listed. So if a building, in fact, there's one, the park, there is this little tower. So that is listed in one of the late 19th century documents as an early example that used lime concrete, if I'm not mistaken. So, if they're using lime, so I'm basically mapping out the ecosystem of materials. I'm trying to figure out labor groups. Basically, even today, a concrete project needs a carpenter to do the formwork. You need a bar bender, and you need people to mix the concrete, and then you need machines to ram it. So I'm extrapolating that on historical examples to say, okay, how would they have done formwork? So just one quick example, like I've looked at a lot of bridges that were constructed in the late 19th century, fast-flowing bridges across the Indus, across the Ganges. You can't do formwork. So then what were the substitutes? So using the basic ecosystem of concrete construction today as a framework, I've extrapolated it to try and decode, okay, so how was this done earlier?
Thanks, Gauri. I think we'll just take the last set of questions. There's Grishma who has one, and we'll take probably one more, and then we'll. Rupali, is there anybody else who wants to pose a question, a comment? Okay, Grishma and then Rupali.
First of all, thank you so much to you also and to the prior conversations that we have had since the morning, because on a selfish level, thank you, because all the three conversations have kind of resonated with me as a student who will begin type studio on Monday. So I'm like, all of these conversations have been beneficial. And what I wanted to ask was a little personal, like not everybody would relate to what I have to ask, but I wanted to ask, how does one train oneself to kind of rationalize information in terms of what we often come across as type? Like if you are going out on field and you, as you said, that you go with your body and with your social status, and you are not just an abstract object in the nature. So how do you consciously then rationalize the information that you are getting and see if that actually is what you call type, or if it is something that goes beyond the mere definitions of type?
Yeah, thanks so much, Gauri. I think I just want to address this the conversation on drawing, right? Like because you were drawing as architectural drawings, but I'm just wondering if you also spoke to the builders, the home builders, to ask what the process was, because I think when we were doing this settlement study in Pangna. And we had a whole conversation with the Vishwakarma, the carpenters who the carpenters make the houses, right? And so they had, it was basically kind of when he was describing the house, what he actually drew was a diagram, and the diagram was a proportioning system, which really kind of, okay, this room, you start with one room, or the house with 2 rooms and a veranda. So a series of diagrams which were ways of sort of communicating how somebody would draw to someone else. I mean, how somebody would make to the other artisans, and I kind of also gave that little anecdote in the morning about this kind of miniature painting that we found where they were. So I'm sure there are processes through which builders also communicate with each other. So I'm just wondering if in your fieldwork you came across any of those kind of drawings.
I'll just respond to this and then I'll come to her question. Yeah. So in this case, in most cases, families build the houses themselves, and they usually, the house literally comes up in layers, and there are very few people, because these mud houses last a surprisingly long time. So there were actually very few people who built a house themselves. They're living in houses that were built 60, 70, even 100 years ago. They have rectangular plans, and the dimensions are determined by the span of the wooden post that's going to go on top. Beyond that, they didn't seem to need any further detail. In terms of sequence, it's fairly minimal. Mud houses raised 30 centimeters at a time, wooden post, rafters, and clay tiles on top. So they don't they are not conceptualizing anything very complex. In that sense, it's similar to the Bunga that Sandeep mentioned. You're probably not going to need a diagram because it's a straightforward volume. The other thing, however, is that many Adivasis now work as construction laborers. So on the one hand, their indigenous technologies are very basic, but they are working on very sophisticated construction sites. They're working in mines, they're working in factories, so they understand complex construction. But for their own homes, they don't seem to require, they don't seem to make a diagram, is what, for Grishma's question, I'm blanking out now. What did you...
Grishma, can you repeat it again?
I'm
so
sorry.
sorry.
Just give me a clue and it'll come back to me. Typology. How do you make sense of...
How do you rationalize the information that you are
So you rationalize it afterwards, not on site. The general principle of fieldwork, at least for me, is to capture as much information in whatever form it was given. We are already filtering it, obviously, but I would record entire conversations, not delete anything, and then sit and go through and make notes. Because that empirical material that you get can be interpreted in many ways. So the important thing, at least my first principle, is to record as much. So you come back with masses of data, which you have to then sit and sort out depending on what is it that you seek. But usually it happens that over time you read the same thing in different ways. Like now, so many years after that study, I have a very different reading of these houses. They are no longer Santal houses actually. They are South Jharkhand houses, because houses are the same whether you go to Odisha, Jharkhand. Bihar becomes different. It's a different geography, so the houses are different. So you just read the material differently, but on field, capture everything.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I was wondering, when you were talking about this idea of representation and, when they sort of decided to select the sacred grove, and going back to what Rupa said, what would a drawing or a plan and section of a sacred grove give us? And why are we so invested in that if that is the cultural life, using a plan and section to draw a house? Because it really doesn't, like, how do you draw the spirit of the house so I was just wondering that if there is, like, it's an energy, right, or a certain kind of forces that, which is also why the question of signification of a house, the photograph or it doesn't fall into that. So there's a certain energy, to the cultural life. And how does one sort of, draw that out?
I don't draw it. In the sense that it depends on what I want to make of it. Having said that, there is this whole project, you might be familiar, there are a lot of publishing houses now that are working with Adivasi artists on trying to represent their own environments. In some cases, it has been really quite wonderful. A lot of Tara books are really nice because they're working with artists. In the case of the Santals, it was very interesting because there is really no material culture. And there are no traditional art forms. So in fact, the house is the only thing that they make. Otherwise, there is hardly anything inside the house, hardly any clothes, hardly any utensils. It's a very, very sparse material culture. So the complexity and the sort of really wonderfulness of the house is a very odd contrast. And I also know, based on the archival work that I did, that the houses, as we see it now, it's in a sense, it's modern. Until the 19th century, a lot of the Santals were semi-nomadic. So it's very much, ironic as it may seem, the house is very much a modern thing. So if there is a vocabulary of expression that I'm able to find at some point in time, I will do that. But otherwise, it is it is sort of embedded. They have a very rich musical culture. There's a lot of poetry which has been recorded by people, and a lot of that captures a sense of the landscape.
Thanks, Gauri, for all those responses and even the talk. And I think one of the things, and I'll close on this note, is one of the things that we've been thinking about and working with at sea when we frame the question of drawing is one kind of coordinate has been to kind of move beyond the idea of cartographic drawing and how do you explore other forms of drawing. But we've kind of trying to open out the idea of drawing as not only drawing on paper, but also in the form of drawing out through texts, songs, poems, and other ways of drawing something out from something that you want to kind of point out to. So drawing out in its kind of wholest sense. And then the question that emerges is in the space that one works in is how does one politicize the act of drawing out? So I think so that some of the things that seem to be concerning us as a group at this moment in time. So thank you for your talk and look forward to many more conversations with you. Thank you to everybody sitting here. It's 5:15. Prasad is in military mode. So 5:30. In line, everybody.